Professor Alam, let me say a few words about yourself and how we will run this event. Anwar Alam is a senior fellow with Policy Perspectives Foundation. This is a think tank in New Delhi. Previously, he was working as a full professor in the Department of International Relations in Zirve University. This was a university in Gaziantep, southeast of Turkey, before it was taken over by the Turkish government and shuttered. He worked in various universities in India, Jamia Millia Islamiyya. This is the National Islamic University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Aligarh Muslim University in the past. His recent area of interest is Muslim minorities in the West. This speech today is based on a book project. We have a book for sale also on the back that took about 5 years to 10 years almost, yeah. I was involved in one of the initial interviews he had done in the headquarters of Zaman Media Group, once again shuttered by the Erdogan regime in Turkey after the coup attempt in 2016. It was 2011, so we have been waiting for the book for some time now. But it also gives us quite a bit of historical process, because it started back in 2010 as a project, and for almost 10 years Professor Alam observed the change and the dynamics of change and continuity within Hizmet. In his book, Professor Alam puts Hizmet into an interesting position by means of modernity. He's not modern, he's not anti-modern. The movement is not trying to be apologetic by means of modernity, or is not trying to create a rhetoric saying that we are also modern and so on. So he's going to speak about Hizmet as a case study, but in a wider perspective, being Muslim in the modern. I hope his presentation will be about half an hour, and later on we will continue on with the questions and answers. During the Q&A, please feel free to take drinks and so on, so that this becomes a family discussion table. Professor Alam.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation to be here. And I'm personally very pleased and glad to see Karim Balji, in the physical sense of the term, actually. So a great meeting with him once again after a long gap. And with regard to this book, probably a couple of the points that I would like to briefly put before all of you for the larger discussions, in fact. Well, to be very honest, that I was not aware of the Gulen movement, even the term, till 2008, actually. Well, I have been engaged with an Islamic movements, with the various kinds of, but probably this 1 week visit to Istanbul by invitation by the Zaman newspaper that time, that's how the entire process basically started, in fact. And slowly and gradually I did develop an interest. I have in the book, I have taken a position that the Gulen movement is basically a postmodern phenomena. And therefore, any kind of probably the discourse that try to see the kind of the compatibility, or there's a very powerful hegemonic dominant understanding of this whole issue of compatibility between Islam and democracy, and Islam and the modernity. I see the Gulen movement as a kind of an experiment or a kind of exploration of the ideas that sees and would like to explore further a very kind of the reflexive critical engagement with its own Islamic traditions in the past, as well as a very kind of the critical reflexive engagement with the modernity itself, or the tradition of modernity itself. So that I see, actually. So, and from this point of view, that it's not about Islamicizing modernity as such, but the movement does form or does promote its own form of modernity. I mean, that's for sure. There has been a very two kinds of the research on the Gulen movements, if I have to look at the literatures and the other thing. One is that there is this bunch of probably sociological work and the work by the political science background, that because of the focus of the Gulen movement on humanity or the human-centered, they tend to see that the movement has inherent capacity to move in the direction of secularization process. I mean, something what's happened with the Protestant kind of, The second is that probably they see that since the movement is also the 24 hours Islam, engagement 24 hours, I always say this, and therefore it has an inherent tendency to promote its own kind of Islamicizing framework. I somehow discount both the possibility. So it is neither forming any kind of Islamicizing, nor promoting the Western understanding of the kind of the secularisms or secularizations process. I really do not see that. But I do see that the movement would like to have a deeper engagement with its own tradition of Islam and the various traditions of the modernity itself. So I don't see that's basically happening. Having said this, the crucial questions in the book is, now the situation is different, but the crucial question in the book is that what made the movement successful in terms of educational breakthrough, and to transform itself into a kind of the social movement, because I've interviewed more than 100 people closely associated with the movements, lay people on the street also. Initially, I started with the interview of the CHP and some of the Kemalists and some of the MHP, but beyond a point, I really could not have much interaction with them, because for them, something that there's a very mathematical calculation in which the secular is good and Islam is bad. And then everything finishes off. It's a very mathematical kind of, you can't have a conversations beyond. That's a typical in a Turkish kind of a setting, actually. So, and there is always this fear about the Hizmet movements. But they would not explain that, why this fear. But they would believe that it is fear. But they would not explain why. So, this question was very crucial, in fact. And probably the large focus was that the Huzefendi and probably Fatehullah Gulen talks about education, and that's how I don't see that way, actually, because it's not Fatehullah Gulen who is the only Islamic who talks about the value of education. There has been before him and probably after him, there will be the large number of the Islamic scholars who are talking about education and why education is important. And everybody probably quoting the hadith, in fact, that for the education you go to China and blah, blah, China, blah, blah, kinds of stuff. We see in India, we see in Africa. But nonetheless, that kind of educational breakthrough has really not taken place. But in the context of Turkey, it is not merely the questions of one Islamic figure speaking on this issue, but also becoming a kind of the social movements where the millions of people really got involved in this project, actually, and generously funding. So I could see that a very small shopkeepers are basically giving 2 to 3 fellowship to the Indonesian students. The students from Indonesia is sponsoring 3 fellowship, is sponsoring 4 fellowship. So it does become, in the Turkish specific context, a kind of probably the large number of participation and transforming in a very kind of the social movements. My first observation is that when I look at, for example, the representations and how the movement has represented in the English literature, I mean, that's my only language where I do not know Turkish, and I could not pick up the Turkish also. But I scanned how the movement and the Hizmet scholars have presented, So my first problem began that when I really interacted with the larger periphery of the Hizmet. And I really found them very die-hard religious in every sense of the term. And when you interact with some of their very sophisticated advanced secular kind of terminology, then you will find that it's a civic secular kind of a movement, it's a faith inspired kind of, but there's an element of secularity. And somehow there is this idea that Islam has not been very properly emphasized in this movement actually. So for the first time I realized that there is a very powerful disjunction in terms of imagination of the movement among its larger volunteers and the way the movement has been presented in the English literature as such. And after this, finally I came to the conclusion that, and I hold this position very closely, that the movement is basically, it is an Islamic Sunni Orthodox movement as such, that's for sure. Now somehow this English term orthodoxy is being assumed in terms of very conservative or kind of reactionary. I do not mean that. When I use the term orthodoxy, I essentially means that your own imagination of the correct practice of Islam. Nothing beyond that. That's it. Nothing beyond that. But it is the kind of orthodoxy that you do find, and therefore this movement basically negotiate with this Islamic positions with all kinds of modern questions, whether the questions of equality or the questions of the freedom or the questions of the humanity or the questions of the women emancipation or the question of democracy. It negotiates with these positions actually. So with this position, probably it will have a serious problem vis-a-vis the modern discourse of individualism, that's for sure. The movement doesn't internalize the discourse of which is the key of any kind of the discourse of modernity as such, that's for sure. So it have a serious reservation. It would certainly emphasize the individual rights, but at the same time, the question of community is extremely important for this movement. So you do not find in the European sense of that term that individualism circulating. Also is that you do not see probably that a movement basically celebrates modernity and the institutional expression of the modernity, like for example that centralization, like for example the homogenization, like for example the secularizations, like for example these are the core values of the modernity. But essentially in terms of probably what has been celebrated in the name of the modernity, like for example pluralism, diversity, human rights, equality, friendship. I mean, the movement would take a position. These are basically the universal values belonging to all religious traditions. This is nothing specific about modern as such. And if the modernity today celebrates these, that's a different issue, but these are fundamentally that belong to all religious tradition. The question of love, the question of peace, the question of friendship, the question of compassions. And therefore it has a very highly, what I would say, very Sufi kind of understanding of the human. But I do not also see that is typically a Sufi movement. That's how it has been branded in the West. I mean, for me that movement is a combination of combined. And probably all Islamic movement is combination of all. You have a Sharia, you have a Sufi, you have a Sunni, you have Salafi. All these elements are present. So not only typical Sufi kinds of which has, and the Sufi connects precisely because of this understanding of modernity, because it has an inherent tendency of privatization of the religion, and therefore there is a relationship directly between God and individual, and all the mediating structure has been broken as such. So it works well as far as the Western spaces are concerned actually, But that's how it has been, but I don't see that way, in fact. The other thing is that probably the key question is that as far as the educational breakthrough is concerned, I see two important contributions that, and based on my interviews, based on my reading of Fatehullah Gulen, and based my all kinds of, there are two things. One thing I realized that that in the deeper structure of writing of the Fatehullah Gulen, I would not quote the particular stanzas, but what you find that there are two elements. One element is that there is a very powerful theological recognition of change. And that's the ultimate reality. And that's a permanent reality. All other things are constant. So the Quran is constant, Hadith is constant, Bible is constant, Indian constitution is constant. They are only subject to the reinterpretation. Nothing else. But what is really very foul, and what is also happening is that the most of the Islamic movements, which has appeared in the 19th century, 20th century, while they wanted to adjust a change, but they also became die-hard apologetic. So they would say democracy, that means there's Islamic democracy. They would say nationalism, okay, Islamic nationalism. So we'll only prefix the Islamic category before any kinds of the modern categories as such. So we have everything. Okay, no, we have surah, we have this, we have this. Maybe in your everyday life, you have not internalized any discourse, but you will only put it. That's not the case here, basically, in fact, So there's a very powerful, and that will basically go with the Mujaddidi kind of the Islamic tradition that we have to really reinterpret the text in accordance with the demand of the age, which is the most dominant, universally acceptable values. So at least I see in this movement that there is a very powerful theological recognition of change with an idea that it has to be open towards future and it is not past oriented. So while the movement certainly builds and inspired on the Islamic history, on the role model of the Prophet himself, that's for sure, and the role model of Sahaba, that's for sure, but he is not looking into the past. It's basically the future, actually, modern, in fact. So that's become very clear, in fact. That's a subtle structure with the Fatihullah Gulen discourse, in fact. The second is that it is also a very powerful, I would say that, human-centered Islamic theology. So humans actually emerge, and therefore you find very interestingly is that what makes Fatihullah Gulen to invest in human resources. There has been never, over the last, if I have to look at 400 and 500 years, none of the Islamic models have really built the institutions. This movement is concerned about building institutions. I'm not talking only about school, university, media, but I'm saying is that it has a remarkable vision of building an institutions everywhere, actually, And this institution has been built with an idea that it is not merely the question of the correct practice of Islam as per your imagination, but the Fatihullah Gulen in person and also the movement in general is very much engaged with an idea of representation of Islam. That how do you represent Islam? It's the whole question of the image of Islam. Therefore, what you find very interestingly is that wherever this movement is visibly present, they're very much present in the city center, actually. They will have an office there. It's a very conscious choice. They do not live in the periphery. No matter how much money you have to spend, but there's a very powerful philosophical background that how do you represent, how do you imagine your movement, how do you present your movement. And you will always see that in the Fatihullah Gulen, all the time this questions comes, the representation of Islam. What really matters is not science and technology, but how are you representing, which tradition of Islam are you representing, how the people are observing. So that's remarkable, actually. The third point in this discourse which I realize is that, and where I think the Fatihullah Gulen has made a very important contribution, is number one is this, that he made the issue of education. First he did that, for example, is that he basically debunked any contradiction or a conflict between what is called the Islamic education and a secular education. For the last 500 years, the Muslim world is internally torn between these two categories. And the Islamic education or the Islamic studies itself is a product in reaction to the Western modernity as such. That how to deal with the Western modernity, how to deal with the colonial form of modernity. The only thought they were thought that we can have a madrasa, we can save the Islam. That happened with for example, in India also. That happened in Turkey also. Probably in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. Large number of Anatolian parents did not send their children to the Kemalist school or Kemalist government schools because of the fear that there are high degree of chances of corruption of their Islamic belief. So as a result, the Muslim majority Anatolian could not figure out and could not find a proper representation proportionate to their population into the government structure. Not because of any design by what I see this word, In Turkey, there is one typical word which I get to know, which is called deep state. And wherever I will go, everybody will talk about a deep state. So that was, for a few years, I was very, confused about this word deep state, because it is so invisible. But I personally believe is that if the majority of the Sunni Muslim majority really did not find their representation in the power structure, not because of any deep state or because of conspiracy or because of any design, but because they were educationally backward. That's for sure. They did not seek any education. That was the only structure that was available. A section of their white could move, section of Kemalist, atheists, and the other, because they were competitive enough, in fact, It is only with the 60s and 70s with the Fatehullah Gulen, and by the time you became an educational force, you started competing with the white Turks. And that became a serious problem. That competition became a serious problem. That's for sure, actually, So one question was that Huzef Handi or Fatehullah Gulen could really debunk this whole 500 years of difference, which is more prior, Islamic studies or secular studies, and would say that education is basically a central value, is an Islamic value. So there's a very paradigm shift. So education is an Islamic value, any kind of education. And therefore, I am really surprised that I met a couple of the Hizmet people in Germany last month, and they were teaching music. For me, it is very surprising that because I come from the South Asian background and the Indian background, I really cannot imagine any Muslim teaching a music, because music is haram, as per their understanding of Islam, as per their imagination of the Islams, actually. Where you find that any kind of education, any kind of the schools, paintings, musics, others, it does basically promotes. And second is that Fatehullah Gulen would be in a position to link education with your Muslim identity or a Muslim faith. That in order to be Muslim, education is the most powerful, most important criteria. Otherwise, you would not be in a position either to promote Islam or the values or defend Islam or to argue about that. So he linked, and that's how you do find that there has been a very remarkable breakthrough. So he would say probably that whatever the structure is available, you have to seek an education. Probably he is probably the only Islamic scholars who would also take a position that if possible for the girls that you take an education and you go for with your hijab, but where it is not legally permissible, I would prefer that you go with hijab, but where it is not legally permissible, then you abandon hijab, but you must seek education. So he could see, because then his understanding is that essentially in terms of what Islams and blah, blah kinds of stuff. So that's what I believe is that it was a remarkable reformulation of the Islamic traditions in a very different modern context. And secondly is that if you want to deal with a change, you need to develop your capacity. And education is one of the most important tools to generate and promote your capability and the capacity, actually. And therefore, it is only essentially in this sense that somebody one would be in a position to overcome any kind of the fear. I always believe that there is I do believe, but I do not want to make or disrespect to anybody here. But I see that there is a fundamental differences in approach. The way Fatehullah Gulen approached to Islam and the way Badiuzzama Sayyid Nursi approached Islam. But when I was trying to interview the large number, they would say that Badiuzzama Sayyid Nursi is an architect and he's a basically implementer of that ideas. And I found very reductionist that kind of an understanding. He's a remarkable different approaches towards Islam, towards idea of peace, towards idea of love, towards idea of, I will find Badiuzzama Sayyid Nursi relatively far more exclusive and far more conservative than probably Fatehullah Gulen. That comes very clear to me, actually. And it is essentially in this sense that why Fatehullah Gulen would focus on the education, because it is the one attribute that can lead you, that can empowers you to overcome any kind of the fear. And for last 300 and 200 years, if there is a one thing that the Muslims have been extremely afraid, it's the idea of being modern. Extremely, I would say. Whether in South Asia or the Muslims, it's the idea of being modern. Because idea of being modern essentially means that it's an anti-Islamic position, I think that one of the important contribution of Fatehullah Gulen is that making Muslims to overcome this fear, actually. And when I conducted an interview in India and Turkey, or for example in Bangkok and some of the places, one of the response that I get from the Hizmet movement, right? For example, I ask them, what is that the Hizmet movement has given you? And interestingly, in the Hizmet movement, everybody, and most of the people are in the Hizmet movement, I will find that they are for the last 30 years and 20 years. Nobody is there for the last 2 years. Everybody has a very long-term associationships, So that was very interesting, very long-term associationships, So I asked this, that what is that Hizmet movement has given you? And I asked at least minimum 20 and 25 people across different countries, actually. And invariably, I was surprised also with her response, because the different cultural, different context, different nation. Invariably, they would say, Hojam, the Hizmet movement has given me this confidence that I can tour the globe, I can move the globe with an idea and with a confidence that my Islam will remain intact. I don't have any fear. And that was a remarkable. I see that large number of my South Asian friends who live in UK or Turkish friends, they always move with the long list of which ingredients are halal and which ingredients are haram and how the space are un-Islamizing and which is the space itself become very fearful. Where to go? That you have a very powerful mental block with regard to the European spaces, No, this is what this movement has really done, that it completely treats modernity as a kind of a very normal object, an object that is the part of your being, actually, an object you can deal with that. This is something that is the part of Islamic process. And this has happened precisely because the Hizmet movement internally, which I could really realize that it is internally opposed to any ideological understanding of things. So it would understand modernity as a part of the continuity and change process. It would also understand Islam as a part of continuity and change. So Islam is a social process, not necessarily ideological understanding of Islam. Modernity is a social process, not necessarily that ideological understanding. And therefore, the movement is inherently opposed to any kind of deism. So absolutely secular is fine, but not secularism. Liberal is fine, not liberalism, that's for sure. National is fine, not nationalism, that's for sure. Islam is fine, not Islamism. So it has a remarkable, and it is essentially how that I would believe that the movement has been remarkable, very successful. These are the few remarks I thought to initiate the discussion, because the roundtable, as and when some of the questions would come, I will certainly respond and we'll have a more discussion on such. But it was just a few remarks. There are some other things in the book also available, but these are the preliminary remarks I wanted to make. Thank you very much.